Before Egypt raised its pyramids, before Greece dreamed of democracy, a strip of land between two rivers gave birth to something the world had never seen, the city. Here, in the scorched plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates, human beings first learned to write down their thoughts, to codify their laws, to worship gods they carved from clay and fear, and to fight wars over water itself. They called their land Sumer, and later Akkad, and later Babylon, but the rivers never changed, and neither did the hunger for power that rose along their banks. For nearly 3,000 years, empires would rise from this mud only to collapse back into it. Kings would claim they ruled by divine right, and then vanish into dust within a generation. Cities that once held 80,000 people would be swallowed by sand, their names forgotten until archaeologists pulled their broken walls back into the light. Somewhere beneath these ruins lies the first war, the first betrayal, the first law ever written down to control what a human being could and could not do to another. This is the story of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, where civilization itself was invented, tested, broken, and rebuilt again and again. And it begins not with a king, but with a single question that changed everything: what happens when a settlement of farmers becomes too large to be governed by memory alone? The land between the rivers did not look like the cradle of civilization. It looked like mud. Flat, cracked, wind-scoured mud stretching to a horizon broken only by the shimmer of heat. And yet it was here, roughly 6,000 years ago, in the southern floodplain of what is now Iraq, that a group of farming communities began to do something no human society had attempted at this scale. They stayed. Generation after generation, they refused to move on, because the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, though violent and unpredictable, left behind something no forest or steppe could offer: silt. Black, fertile, endlessly renewing silt that could feed a population far larger than any single family or clan could ever consume alone. This abundance created a problem no hunter-gatherer band had ever faced. Surplus grain needed to be stored, protected, counted, and distributed. Who decided how much a farmer owed to the temple that stored his surplus in lean years? Who tracked how many sheep a merchant had pledged in trade? Memory was no longer enough. And so, in the city of Uruk, sometime around 3400 to 3100 BCE, priests and administrators began pressing reed styluses into wet clay, creating small wedge-shaped marks to represent numbers, then goods, then eventually sounds and words. This system, later known as cuneiform, is the earliest writing system known to survive in the archaeological record. It was not born from poetry or philosophy. It was born from bookkeeping. From the need to know exactly how much barley was owed, and to whom. Uruk itself grew into something the ancient world had never witnessed: a true city, walled and dense, home to tens of thousands of people, centered on towering temple complexes called ziggurats that reached toward the gods the Sumerians believed governed every river flood, every harvest, every human fate. Chief among these gods was Anu, the Sky Father, and Inanna, goddess of love and war, whose temple at Uruk became one of the most powerful religious institutions in the ancient world. The Sumerians did not see their kings as simply military leaders. They saw kingship itself as something that had descended from heaven, a divine institution granted to specific cities at specific times, according to their own king lists, which blend genuine historical rulers with clearly legendary figures who were said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years before a great flood swept the land. That flood tradition would echo across the millennia. Centuries later, the Sumerians told the story of a king named Gilgamesh, ruler of Uruk, whose fear of death sent him on a desperate journey to find eternal life, only to learn that mortality was the one truth even kings could not escape. Woven into his epic was the account of a man named Utnapishtim, who survived a catastrophic flood sent by the gods by building a great boat and saving his family and the animals of the earth. The Epic of Gilgamesh, first assembled from earlier Sumerian poems, stands as one of the oldest works of literature in human history, and its flood narrative bears a striking resemblance to stories that would appear centuries later in other Near Eastern traditions, a resemblance historians attribute to a shared regional memory of catastrophic Mesopotamian flooding rather than to any single supernatural event. But Sumer was never a single nation. It was a patchwork of independent city-states: Uruk, Ur, Kish, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, and others, each with its own king, its own patron god, and its own ambitions. And where there is ambition, there is conflict. The city-states of Sumer fought constantly over the resource that mattered more than gold: water. Canals that irrigated one city's fields could be diverted or destroyed by a rival, turning fertile land to dust in a single season. One of the earliest documented wars in human history was fought between the cities of Lagash and Umma over a stretch of agricultural land called Guiden, a border dispute recorded on a monument known as the Stele of the Vultures, which depicts the king of Lagash leading his soldiers in tight phalanx formation, spears raised, marching over the bodies of their enemies. This is not myth. This is among the earliest surviving depictions of organized warfare in the human record, carved in stone to be remembered forever. For centuries, no single city could permanently dominate the others. Power shifted from Kish to Uruk to Ur and back again, each ascendant king claiming the title King of Kish as a symbolic marker of supremacy over the land, even when his actual authority barely extended beyond his own city walls. This endless cycle of rivalry might have continued indefinitely had it not been for a man whose origins were, according to later legend, humbler than any king before him. His name was Sargon, and the stories that grew up around him claim he was born in secrecy, placed in a basket of reeds sealed with pitch, and set adrift on the Euphrates River, only to be found and raised by a gardener before rising to serve as cupbearer to the king of Kish. Whether or not this dramatic origin story is literal history or later political myth-making, historians agree on what came next was very real. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon overthrew his king and began a series of military campaigns that would accomplish something no Mesopotamian ruler had ever achieved: the unification of the Sumerian city-states under a single centralized empire, with a new capital at Akkad, a city whose exact location remains undiscovered by modern archaeologists to this day. The Akkadian Empire, and the language that came with it, transformed the region. For the first time, Mesopotamia had something resembling a unified administrative and military structure stretching from the Persian Gulf toward the Mediterranean coast. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, pushed the empire to even greater heights, and in a striking act of political and religious self-elevation, declared himself a living god, having his own name inscribed with the divine determinative previously reserved for deities alone. His victory stele, celebrating a triumph over a mountain people called the Lulubi, shows Naram-Sin towering over his enemies wearing a horned helmet, a symbol of divinity itself. Empires built on conquest, however, tend to collapse under the same weight that raised them. The Akkadian Empire began to fracture within a few generations, weakened by internal rebellion, the strain of administering a vast and culturally diverse territory, and, according to both ancient inscriptions and modern climate research, a severe and prolonged drought that struck the region around 2200 BCE. Sumerian scribes, writing generations later, blamed the fall of Akkad on divine punishment, claiming the god Enlil unleashed a mountain people called the Gudians to ravage the land as retribution for Naram-Sin's arrogance. Modern historians read this differently, seeing in the Akkadian collapse one of the earliest documented examples of a civilization brought low by a combination of climate stress, overextension, and internal political fracture, a pattern that would repeat throughout Mesopotamian history and, indeed, throughout the history of empires everywhere. Out of this chaos rose one final great flowering of purely Sumerian culture. Around 2112 BCE, a king named Ur-Nammu founded the third dynasty of Ur, reunifying much of southern Mesopotamia and initiating a period modern historians call the Sumerian Renaissance. Ur-Nammu is credited with issuing one of the earliest known law codes in human history, predating the more famous Babylonian code that would follow centuries later. His code did not simply list punishments, it attempted to establish standardized measures, weights, and compensations, an early attempt to make justice something predictable rather than purely arbitrary. Ur itself, under this dynasty, became a marvel of ancient urban planning, with a great ziggurat dedicated to the moon god Nana rising above a city of scribes, merchants, and craftsmen whose sophistication rivaled anything else on earth at the time. Yet this golden age, too, would not last. The third dynasty of Ur fell within roughly a century, worn down by invasions from Elamite forces to the east and Amorite migrations from the west, and by internal economic strain that some scholars believe was worsened by the increasing salinization of irrigated farmland. A slow ecological poison that had been building for centuries of intensive agriculture in the region. Sumerian, the language that had given the world its first written words, gradually ceased to be spoken as a living tongue, surviving only as a scholarly and religious language, the way Latin would survive in medieval Europe long after Rome had fallen. Semitic-speaking Amorite peoples increasingly filled the political vacuum left behind. It was an Amorite dynasty, ruling from a once minor city on the Euphrates, that would produce the ruler whose name remains among the most recognized in the ancient world. Hammurabi ascended to the throne of Babylon around 1792 BCE, inheriting a modest kingdom surrounded by more powerful rivals. Through decades of shifting alliances, calculated betrayals, and military campaigns, Hammurabi systematically absorbed his neighbors, eventually bringing much of Mesopotamia under Babylonian control. But Hammurabi is remembered less for his conquests than for what he left behind, a towering black stone stele, nearly 7.5 feet tall, inscribed with 282 laws governing nearly every aspect of Babylonian life, from property disputes and commercial contracts to marriage, inheritance, and violent crime. The Code of Hammurabi is famous for its principle of proportional retribution, often summarized as an eye for an eye, though the actual text reveals a far more complex and stratified system, where punishments varied significantly depending on the social class of both the offender and the victim. A crime committed against a noble carried different consequences than the same crime committed against a commoner or an enslaved person, revealing a society that valued order and hierarchy in equal measure. What made the code so significant was not necessarily its originality, since earlier Sumerian and Akkadian legal traditions had come before it, but its scale, its permanence carved in stone for public display, and its explicit claim that the king ruled not merely by force but by divine mandate to establish justice on earth. Babylon's first golden age, however, proved as fragile as those before it. Within roughly a century and a half of Hammurabi's death, the Babylonian state weakened considerably, and around 1595 BCE, a Hittite raiding force struck from the north, sacking the city itself in a stunning demonstration of just how vulnerable even the greatest Mesopotamian capital could be to a fast-moving military campaign from beyond the region. In the power vacuum that followed, a people called the Kassites, whose origins remain debated among historians, took control of Babylon and ruled the region for roughly 4 centuries, a long and comparatively stable period about which surprisingly little dramatic history survives, perhaps itself a testament to a rare era of relative peace in a land defined by conflict. While Babylon rose and fell in the south, a different power was steadily gathering strength in the north, along the upper Tigris River. The Assyrians had existed as a trading and political entity for centuries, their merchants establishing trade colonies deep into Anatolia long before their kings became feared across the ancient world. But it was in the centuries following 1000 BCE that Assyria transformed into something unprecedented, a military machine of staggering efficiency and brutality, engineering the first empire in world history to systematically govern vast, ethnically diverse territories through a combination of terror, deportation, and administrative innovation. Assyrian kings did not merely defeat their enemies, they documented their conquests in exhaustive detail, carving palace walls with relief sculptures depicting cities besieged, populations impaled or flayed, and enemy kings led away in chains, propaganda designed to convince rebellious vassals that resistance was suicide. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II, Tiglath-Pileser III, and Sennacherib expanded Assyrian control across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and into Egypt itself at the empire's height. Tiglath-Pileser III in particular reorganized the empire's administration, replacing client kingdoms with directly governed provinces and pioneering the systematic deportation of conquered populations. A policy intended to break local identities and prevent rebellion by scattering people far from their homelands. The Assyrian capital shifted over the centuries, eventually settling at Nineveh, a city Sennacherib transformed into one of the largest and most magnificent urban centers the ancient world had ever seen, complete with elaborate irrigation systems and gardens that some historians have speculated may have inspired the later legend of Babylon's Hanging Gardens, though this connection remains a matter of genuine scholarly debate rather than settled fact. It was at Nineveh, under the reign of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, that one of the most extraordinary achievements of the ancient world took shape, a vast royal library containing tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, gathered from across Mesopotamia, preserving religious texts, medical treatises, astronomical records, and literary works including the most complete surviving version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. When archaeologists rediscovered this library in the 19th century CE, buried beneath the ruins of Nineveh, they recovered more Mesopotamian literature and knowledge in a single find than had survived anywhere else combined. Yet even Assyria's terrifying military supremacy could not escape the same fate that had claimed every Mesopotamian power before it. The empire had grown too large, too dependent on constant conquest to sustain its economy and its army, and too hated by the populations it had brutalized for generations. In 626 BCE, a Babylonian general named Nabopolassar rebelled against Assyrian rule, and in an alliance with the Median kingdom to the east, launched a devastating campaign against the Assyrian heartland. In 612 BCE, the combined Babylonian and Median forces besieged and destroyed Nineveh itself, a city so recently the center of the known world that its sudden and total collapse was later remembered as an almost apocalyptic event, referenced even in later biblical prophecy as a symbol of divine judgment against imperial cruelty. From the ashes of Assyrian power rose the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the final great flowering of native Mesopotamian civilization. Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, became the empire's most famous ruler, expanding Babylonian control across the Levant and, in a campaign remembered vividly in later religious tradition, conquering Jerusalem and deporting a significant portion of its population to Babylon, an event that would profoundly shape Jewish history and theology for centuries afterward. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon itself was rebuilt into a city of legendary scale, its famous Ishtar Gate covered in glazed blue bricks depicting striding lions and dragons, its ziggurat, the Edamananjo, rising so dramatically above the flat landscape that later traditions would remember it as the biblical Tower of Babel. Ancient sources also describe magnificent hanging gardens at Babylon, though modern archaeology has never definitively located physical evidence of them at the site, and some historians now argue the gardens described by later Greek writers may actually describe a garden built at Nineveh rather than Babylon itself, a genuine and unresolved historical mystery. But even this final Babylonian Renaissance carried the seeds of its own end. Nebuchadnezzar's successors proved far less capable, and the empire's later king, Nabonidus, alienated the powerful Babylonian priesthood by favoring the moon god Sin over Babylon's traditional patron deity, Marduk, while spending years away from the capital in the Arabian oasis of Tama, leaving his son Belshazzar to govern in his absence. This religious and political instability left Babylon vulnerable at precisely the moment a new power was rising in the east. Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, had already unified the Medes and Persians and conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia when he turned his attention toward Babylon in 539 BCE. According to ancient accounts, Babylonian priests, resentful of Nabonidus's religious policies, may have offered little resistance to the Persian advance, and Cyrus entered the city with comparatively minimal violence, presenting himself not as a conqueror but as a liberator restoring proper worship of Marduk and freeing conquered peoples, including the Jewish exiles deported by Nebuchadnezzar, allowing them to return to their homeland. This moment marks the definitive end of Mesopotamia as an independent seat of imperial power. Never again would a native Mesopotamian dynasty rule the land between the rivers as an independent empire. It would pass instead through the hands of Persians, then Greeks under Alexander the Great, then Parthians, Romans, and eventually into the Islamic world, each new power inheriting a landscape already layered with 4,000 years of cities, laws, gods, and ruins. What remains almost unbelievable, looking back across this immense span of time, is how much of what defines civilization itself first took shape in this single river valley. Writing, codified law, organized urban administration, standardized systems of weight and measure. The concept of a calendar divided into 60 based units of time, an inheritance so deeply embedded in modern life that every time a clock's second hand moves, it echoes a mathematical system devised by Sumerian scribes thousands of years ago. Even the epic hero's journey, the flood narrative, the search for immortality in the face of inevitable death, these are not simply ancient curiosities. They are the earliest recorded expressions of ideas that would echo through every subsequent civilization, reshaped and retold across thousands of years, carried forward long after the ziggurats crumbled and the cuneiform tablets were buried beneath centuries of desert sand. Mesopotamia teaches a difficult truth about power. Every empire that rose from this fertile mud believed, in its moment of triumph, that its dominance was permanent, ordained by the gods, built to last forever. Sargon believed it. Hammurabi believed it. The Assyrian kings who carved their victories into palace walls believed it most violently of all. And every single one of them was wrong. The rivers that gave this land its life cared nothing for human ambition, and neither, in the end, did time itself. What survived was not the power of any single king, but the ideas, the words, and the systems that ordinary scribes, farmers, and administrators built quietly in the shadow of the throne room, the true and lasting legacy of the land between the rivers.